So, we've already gone over the intro of Old World Blues, but now it's time for us to look at what lies beyond. Though it doesn't necessarily do very much for a while, which isn't doing the pacing of this DLC any favors. I've mentioned before that the Big Empty is full of places to explore and learn about. That's certainly true, and I'll be sure to praise those aspects when necessary in later parts. But the main quest itself starts off very lacking even beyond the prologue. Following the very lengthy, and at times redundant introductory dialogue, Old World Blues kicks off with a fetch quest. Alright, so there's a bit more to this mechanically than the term fetch quest may let on. I'm not at all trying to be a reductionist in saying this, but in terms of narrative development, there's very little more than just getting these devices that other people want. The brains of the think tank outright refuse to even elaborate on why the devices are needed in the first place.
It'll all become clear. If not, at least we will have the technology here at the Dome, where all technology belongs.
There is logic and purpose in it. If these technologies are needed to pierce the Forbidden Zone, so be it.
All we have is the motivation of wanting to not be trapped in Big Mountain, which might have worked if the story had more of a focus on the darker elements at play here, but the overabundance of humor makes it very difficult to get into the mindset of feeling like I'm in danger. In a meta sense, why would we even want to leave this DLC? We just started. So as a player, I'm not really engaged. As a character to roleplay, I'm not really engaged. Sure, as a player, I can infer that these devices must be some unique loot given that Klein says they only need the schematics and not the items themselves, but given that the player won't even know what these devices do at this point, the level of investment is going to be quite shallow no matter how you look at it. Once again, and I hope you're not tired of hearing this, Dead Money and Honest Hearts did this so much better. The Sierra Madre is fucking terrifying. So while the player will generally want to keep playing the content they paid for and experience this gripping tale of survival to its conclusion, they very much understand why getting the fuck out of here is several magnitudes of priority more important than whatever loot this place may house, or whatever curiosities the player wants or may still possess. Honest Hearts opens with the player being involved in a group, then suddenly they're isolated upon arriving in Zion when their group is murdered by tribals, and then they go on to meet a spectacular character that's brilliantly voiced with more draw than a banned Exodia deck. Sure, there's some stuff worth looking into here, and a conflict that a good-hearted individual may feel compelled to resolve. But escape was always the priority. The caravan is dead. The goal to establish a line of trade for the Happy Trails Caravan Company is out the window for at least the time being. This is a matter of survival, and it's natural to want to repay the favors granted to you by the dead horses and Joshua while still trying to leave. In Old World Blues, the very reason one would want to escape this place is undermined by the non-stop barrage of humor and downright bizarre plot points that will leave a player too perplexed to even have a solid grasp on the stakes to begin with. This is not a strong way to start this DLC, and the areas we're told to visit do very little to improve upon it, though I'm only referring to those that are mandatory, as several other locations are suggested for acquiring even more technology for the sync. Though that will have to wait for the next part. For the main quest, there are 3 areas that must be visited in order to proceed. The X2 Antenna Array, the X8 Research Center, and the X13 facility. Of these locations, one offers a genuinely interesting and compelling look into the mind of one of the brains of the think tank, one is a series of increasingly complicated objectives that grant additional rewards for completion, and the last is a simple area with next to nothing in terms of rewards and even less in terms of lore. I'll start with the latter since it's consistently the one that I do first, mostly just so I can get it out of the way and be done with it. The X2 Antenna Array is a small tower with some protectrons, at the top of which is the item you need to collect. After acquiring it, an ambush of robo-rad scorpions appear, and the player must escape the area, either by force or with stealth, neither of which are very easy to manage. And that's it. Like, share, and subscribe. You know what annoys me the most about the X2 objective? Right next door, not even 10 feet away from this antenna array, is an area that is significantly more interesting. The antenna array itself is the epitome of what makes for an uninteresting fetch quest, with so little going on that I'd be surprised if anyone even remembered this part of the quest without having played this DLC multiple times. Then there's the X-13 facility, and while there's little in the ways of lore to discover, there's a decent amount of rewarding gameplay to be had here. The highlight, of course, is what the actual quest requires of the player, and that's to acquire a stealth suit and use it to complete a stealth training program that'll grant it an upgrade, or several. The stealth program, at least at the start, is simple to the point of hilarity. All the player needs to do is sneak by some robo-brains into an office and access the safe. This is the only mandatory objective here, and it is laughably easy. On the bright side, there are a few more stealth programs to play out, each with an increasing level of difficulty, and while not particularly hard, they do make for one of the more engaging stealth sections of a Fallout game. And the upgrades to the stealth suit are absolutely worth trying for. I also think it's funny how the whole section can be trivialized just by killing the robo-brains, at which point the player just needs to be on the lookout for the laser wires, which can also be disabled permanently, and the mines, which are pretty easy to avoid and have a generous telegraph. Disabling the lasers permanently requires a high repair skill, and the robo-brains are docile, meaning the average player has no incentive for attacking them during this stealth-focused set piece. It's pretty clever design, all things considered. Robo-Rad Scorpions also invade the facility following the only mandatory run, helping to ensure the player remains engaged even in this slower part of the DLC. It's a bit forced, but by no means frustrating or annoying. Then we have the X-13 Research Center, which is by far the most intriguing of the three. X-13 is the laboratory brainchild of Dr. Boros, with the main part of the facility being a recreation of his old primary school, now used as a playground for various experiments such as cybernetic doggos that, good lord, just put an end to their suffering already. Whilst exploring the school, various pre-recorded announcements by Dr. Boros exclaim passive-aggressive digs at people that we can infer bullied him while he was in school.
Can you spell detention? I'll tell you how I spell it. Death tension. Commie pinko traitors. Oh! Now I will send vicious cybernetic cyborg dogs through the corridors to weed all you traitors out. They will sniff out which among you have chosen the commie path. Especially you, Betsy Bright, who turned me down to the high school dance so you could smoke with Richie Marcus. All monitors will also be vigilant. Step outside during class, and they'll make sure you make a speedy jump back to your desk. Hold your urine and wait for the proper bathroom break time.
This is probably one of the best examples of this DLC absolutely nailing its comedy. Boros has a very entertaining voice. He has a very exaggerative inflection with words of emphasis, standing out perfectly so as to nail the timing of the delivery. The recordings here also put into perspective why Boros specifically would be such an oddball and how socially inept that he is. It's simultaneously entertaining and informative, and it goes a long way in making Boros more likable as a character. Not necessarily as a person, but as a character. That being said, I think it's worth saying just how glad I am that they didn't go the route of trying too hard to humanize him. Keeping in line with the tone of the DLC, while the brains may have personality traits that any number of players could gravitate towards, ultimately they are horrible excuses for humans that will do the most unethical things imaginable for the sake of an interesting experiment. Ethics be damned, reasons be damned, they will take any idea they have for something crazy and just roll with it. The fuckers are responsible for the creation of cazadors, so it's blatantly apparent that Obsidian did not want us liking them as people or sympathizing with them to the point of feeling sorry for them. So instead of playing up Boros being bullied as a child as something to pity him over, they play it up purely for laughs and treat it as this downright silly thing that he's been petulant about for 2 centuries. It's not like they beat you over the head with how he was beaten up every day and forced to drink from a toilet or some horrid shit. No. Another kid put pudding in his pants. All things considered, he kinda had it easy. To further prove how clearly the writers did not really care for the players to like the brains, this section in the school is immediately followed up with a downright absurd set piece revolving around Boros's experiments on dogs, the most significant being his own pet Gabe, which Boros kept drugged for basically the entirety of its life, all the while performing cybernetic surgery and who even knows what other experiments on it. Not only is this beyond forgiving, but the way it's played up for laughs with Boros' ridiculous reminiscings of Gabe is fucking insane. Players with the Wild Wasteland trait will also see a room full of cyberdoggos playing poker. This whole thing is weird as hell, and I fucking love it. This area is capped off with an encounter with Gabe. No, not that doggo. The goal is to search the piles for the device needed to modify the sonic emitter. Killing Gabe isn't too hard, however doing so means triggering the bomb inside of him, yes really, which will explode after a comically slow countdown from Dr. Boros.
Gabe! No! His cyber-dog atomic core! It's active! That means an exceedingly imprecise countdown to critical failure in 10! Boros, why the hell did you install an atomic core? It'll blow them for each one, right?
9. All will be fine.
7. Yes, 7. 6. Halfway to destruction, measured in clicks.
Stealth, of course, is the best go-to here. That or just being a really fast courier who can bounce from one mount to the next very quickly. After acquiring the device, Robo-Rad-Scorpions will appear and most likely take out Gabe, making it all the more imperative that the player get out as soon as possible. But even in the first room of the facility, there will be a number of Robo-Rad-Scorpions ready to take the player out. And even outside there will be a number of not just Robo-Rad-Scorpions that will hone in on the player. It's a pretty tough area, and it makes for a pretty exciting uphill battle. Upon returning to the sink with the devices, Dr. Klein will direct the player to the Forbidden Zone, where the courier can retrieve their brain and put it into the evil schemes of Dr. Mobius once and for all. But before we go to the Forbidden Zone, we're given a chance to talk a bit more with the brains and learn not only about the goings-on of Big Mountain, but about them as people as well. None of the character work really stands out as exemplary, but there's enough here to help the player make an informed decision by the time they've reached the finale of this DLC. All the brains have their own little quirks. Dala misses having a human body so much that she's become insatiably horny at the thought of a human so much as breathing. Don't start wiggling your fingers in front of her, oh god. Dr. O, or Zero, is so pathetically nerdy that he considers the toes of the courier to be larger than what he assumed to be the average length of the penis. 8 is what I assume to be the courier. Wait, what? 8 is what I assume to be what happens when a voice actor or two decides to fuck off to another job. Boros is an actually mentally unstable psychopath, and Dr. Klein is an insatiably curious sociopath with no regard for ethics or morality. I mean, really they all are, but since Klein is the big boss here, that means Big Mountain is his own personal sandbox, which is pretty terrifying to imagine. All of this dialogue pretty much reinforces the notion that these scientists are utter vermin. They'll also recount to the courier how Big Mountain became a crater. Apparently a failed experiment by one Dr. Klein resulted in the mountain itself being vaporized. What the hell this test could have even been is anyone's guess, but the fact that it happened in the first place is certainly bizarre and a bit alarming. However, there is one particularly interesting bit of information that I feel is worth mentioning. Apparently the scientists of the think tank are completely unaware of the Great War that occurred 2 centuries ago. The scientists make very little effort to look beyond the walls of Big Mountain, and their ignorance to what goes on outside their bubble is fascinating. What's especially peculiar is how Klein recounts the encounter with Elijah, Christine, and another courier, noting how peculiar it was for them to have gotten in and escaped as they did. But that is a discussion for another time. So, onto the Forbidden Zone. Right out the gate, literally, there are a lot of Robo-Rad-Scorpions. Like, holy shit, these things are not even worth fighting given how many resources the player's gonna need for the next fight. Upon entering the Forbidden Zone, Mobius summons his most powerful monster, the A to Z Robo-Rad-Scorpion Buster Cannon. Okay, that's not what it's called. This is one of the most dangerous enemies in New Vegas, regardless of your build, level, or playstyle. As it turns out, the real Big Mountain was the health bar we had to deplete along the way. But for those of you wishing to retain your sanity, or just simply lacking the ability to kill this thing, i.e. anyone not role-playing the mole for this thing's whack-a-mole as you poke in and out of cover for the next 15 minutes using your entire arsenal of ammunition, you can make your way around the room and hack the terminal that allows for the shutdown of the god of Big Mountain that this thing is. Destroying it is optional, but considering the amount of times this thing has one-shot me, the Last Judgment draweth nigh, and his name is Mr. Big Fister. For those of you not really sure of what I'm saying at this point, allow me to simplify. Fuck this fight. So after suffering through that abomination of a fight, it's time to meet Dr. Mobius. And this might just be one of the best plot twists in New Vegas, which is really saying something. As it turns out, Dr. Mobius has actually been ensuring that the scientists of the think tank remain trapped here within Big Mountain. Their memories, knowledge, and even curiosities of the outside world expunged from their databanks. The reason Mobius did this was because he wanted to protect the outside world from the threat of the think tank's scientific hubris. And it wasn't until, something that we're going to cover later, that the think tank finally became aware of the outside world. And as it turns out, this happened some time ago, meaning that the brains of the think tank were lying to the courier. Now, given that these are the bastards responsible for cazadors, I can't exactly blame Mobius for doing this. That being said, Mobius basically brainwashed the think tank and has been tripping on Mentats and Psycho for the past 2 centuries while the think tank continues various other unethical experiments. He's also been tormenting the player for the entirety of their quest in the Big Empty with those goddamn robo-rad scorpions. It's also worth noting that rather than actually putting a stop to the think tank's experiments, Mobius opted to let them continue in isolation, resulting in who even knows how many people wandering into Big Mountain and having their brains scooped out, so it's not as if he's entirely innocent either. Whether or not he had the power to stop them is completely up for debate, but his lack of efforts or even attempts to do so, as far as we know, are definitely a cause for caution. But before the courier can decide the fate of the Big Empty, one last loose end must be tied up. The courier's brain. Apparently, it's been chilling in a vat over here in the Forbidden Zone with Dr. Mobius, having delightful conversations over rounds of Mentats, and this is where Old World Blues goes from campy and weird to bordering on Hideo Kojima levels of kooky. So, yeah. The player begins a conversation with their very own brain. It's one of New Vegas' most memorable moments for sure, and the sheer insanity of it is enough to entertain just about any player. I mean, for God's sake, the voice box it's been given sounds like Stewie Griffin, and if that's not comedy, then I don't know what is.
Ah, lovely. Figured that out, have we? Would you like a cookie? Yes, well, believe me, the opposite is equally true. Good Lord, have you bathed at all since they pulled me out of you?
This is indeed a Family Guy funny moment. Unfortunately, nothing about this conversation makes any kind of sense, and the implications are something of a detriment to the entire game. I think the one issue that consistently baffles me when it comes to this dialogue is the fact that the brain's personality doesn't even change based on the type of character that the player has been role-playing. Sure, there are some funny moments for low-intelligence couriers, the cherchez la femme and confirmed bachelor perks make for a funny moment, and having a certain level in various combative stats help to convince the brain that you can take on the think tank, but nothing about the brain or the dialogue sees any significant change. Karma, special stats, reputation, past decisions, build, perks, none of these things have any particular effect on the conversation aside from a couple of funny non-sequiturs, and that's really a shame. Genius savior of New Vegas, mass murdering psychopath, dumb as hell NCR apologist, even more stupid Caesar's Legion apologist? Doesn't matter, cause Stewie Brain has been enjoying those Mentats, so it's a smart brain now with only a single possible personality. And yet, despite how smart the brain universally is, it's too stupid to realize that it's the primary source of glandular impulses.
I'm not the one that makes us clamber around Technus-infested ancient vaults or go charging off to New Vegas on missions of ill-conceived revenge. And have we forgotten who got us shot in the head and buried in a shallow grave? Do you think I enjoyed that little moment? I most certainly am not. I'm the seat of all reason and logic in our little partnership. All those feelings that motivate you, that sense of righteousness and that rush you get when you help someone, do you know where those come from? Glands. They come from glands. Free of the tyranny of your ape-like and primitive endocrine system, I can see how foolish your motives are. Well, look, it's all a very complex system of biofeedback and other things I wouldn't expect you to understand.
Like, I get it, being shot in the head sucked, but this thing's ability to argue is surprisingly vacuous. Also, the brain makes it clear that the device it's using to speak is connected to the prefrontal cortex, confirming that this is the unconscious part of the brain we're speaking to, which does explain how it can talk about not having been in proper control and preventing us from doing things that it did not want. But this presents another issue. Shouldn't this brain sense of self be at a peak? It's been separated from the courier's body, granted increased perception and intelligence by the mentats in the vat, and it's had time on its own, which it has specifically used to read and converse with Mobius. Why wasn't the brain's sense of self even referenced beyond just wanting to be away from the courier and the dangers of the wastes? It doesn't take that much to convince the brain that roaming the wastes and going on adventures was and is actually a ton of fun. But what about the fact that this brain will no longer be able to function as a self once it's been reintegrated in the courier's head? Sure, adventuring is fun, but the prefrontal cortex lacked the ability to stop the courier from doing things that it found either reprehensible or reckless. This thing should honestly be downright terrified at the prospect of reintegrating with the courier. Remember that episode of House where the patient's prefrontal cortex had control over his arm and would downright abuse the poor guy? And the solution was for him to learn to live in harmony with his other self? That kind of shit is so interesting, but Old World Blues doesn't really do anything with it. When it comes down to it, the only consequence of choosing whether or not to take the brain back is what perk you get. But the player can remove or reintegrate it literally whenever they want after the main quest, so there's not even a consequence. The courier's body is also apparently so damn tough that it can handle having its brain removed and reintegrated ad infinitum. Come on, Loveless, it's meant to be wacky and irreverent. You're not supposed to take it that seriously. Just turn your brain off and enjoy the lulls. Sorry, but my brain runs with extensive and hyperactive cognizance over a 5-dimensional plane of existence, and is not only impossible to turn off, but it would drive anyone who attempted to do so into a heretofore unseen madness comparable to that of men who lay their unenlightened eyes upon the eldritch truth that is... But yeah. This whole thing with the brain is really silly, and I enjoy it, but it also makes no fucking sense, which is objectively bad given that Fallout, especially the first two in New Vegas, are quite well known for their logical consistency, minus the unavoidable ludonarrative dissonance that comes with these games being stat-based role-playing games, but that's a concession that you have to make when interacting with this game in the first place. Following the conversation with the brain, the last objective is to go to the think tank, as we can now circumnavigate the pacification field that's prevented players from going full Abby Miller on the brains upon realizing they were responsible for creating Cazadors. The fucking bastards, I'll never forgive them. Killing Mobius is entirely optional, though the question of whether or not he deserves to die is definitely up for debate. I honestly don't think there's a wrong decision here. Sure, Mobius has prevented the brains from experimenting beyond Big Mountain, but he's also allowed for the experiments within to go on for far too long, and the effects of this go as far as the Sierra Madre. It's an interesting dilemma that the game doesn't impose directly, and I really appreciate that. Hell, some players might not even think to try and kill him after having talked to him. There are no long-lasting consequences to killing him aside from the implication that he'll never be able to change the way Big Mountain runs again. I actually really like this though. There didn't need to be a major consequence to his death. It's all about what the player feels is right or wrong, or simply justified. As for what happens next, well, it's pretty clear where things stand. Upon arriving at the think tank, the brains don't even make an attempt to withhold the fact that they plan to go beyond the dome. Their hubris knows no bounds, and it's clear that the technology they have access to is beyond dangerous. The player has two options here. They can either kill the brains and put a stop to all the senseless experiments for good, or they can convince the brains that Mobius has swapped brains with the courier and intimidate the think tank into foregoing any plans to go beyond the dome. Alright then. Alright, look, While I can agree with the notion that anyone who thinks the brains deserve to live would probably be stupid enough to try and convince them of something this ridiculous, I just don't think it works for every kind of character that the player might be role-playing that would want to spare the brains. Why not have an option for the courier, without the comedy, hear me out, to intimidate the brains with threats of violence? I mean, for God's sake, there's literally a perk for this. Or how about convincing the brains that they should stay within the dome, as the wasteland offers too little in the ways of scientific potential? Like the other expansions, the main quest of Old World Blues ends with a summary slideshow to detail the consequences of the courier's decisions. I won't go into all of this just yet, but overall I think it's pretty well done. There are even multiple slides for nearly every facility in Big Mountain should the player have visited them, and that alone gives the exploration a sense of satisfaction that, come to think of it, hasn't been present in any of the other DLC slideshows. But even without the ending slides, Old World Blues definitely has its fair share of exploration to indulge in. But that's gonna have to wait till later. This is a beloved DLC, and I get why. I do. It's downright fucking hilarious at times, and the characters are pretty entertaining. Hell, even the stealth suit AI is fun to listen to. But there's also a number of writing issues that permeate the story, primarily to do with the main quest, and I'm not gonna post a review without talking about these issues as they come up. How these issues impact the experience is up to the individual, but the fact remains that these issues do exist, and they deserve to be scrutinized just as much as the higher quality elements deserve to be praised. And that's really all I have for today. The next couple videos will be covering the side quests and world building, which I'm pretty excited to get to myself, as I consider both to be among the higher quality elements of this DLC. So until we meet again, take care.